it's very clear that if we manage to build tools that amplify our human intelligence with AI, right, we can use it to solve all these problems that have stumped us. Like I have a friend right now who's been diagnosed with incurable cancer. That just means we humans have been so far not been smart enough to solve it. It'll be fantastic if we can solve these things, lift everybody out of poverty, and create this amazing age of prosperity for us humans with us in charge.
Yep.
If you look farther into the future, I think most people had always assumed that maybe in a million years somehow humanity won't be here in its present form. And if you want to go to the Andromeda Galaxy, you
have to be something
you're not
biological.
Flying a meat bag there for 3 million years is much less feasible than, at least at the minimum, uploading yourself and sending yourself there in an intergalactic email to some microconstructors that build you there. So, if you want life to not just thrive here on this little spinning ball, but also throughout much of our universe, of course, you want to have more diverse life forms as well that are more maybe post-biological.
Yes.
But that's very different from saying, I want that to happen in 4 years.
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned in to The Trajectory. The episode that you're about to see with Max Tegmark was recorded live at AI Safety Connect, which was a side event at the AI Action Summit. We have some other episodes from that event as well. In this episode, we touch on some things you know Max for, namely sort of AI governance and risk, but more specifically, what are the linchpins that might get us to some degree of international concord, particularly between the United States and China? What would actually get us on the same page about how far is too far and how those kind of things are enforceable? Max shares some of his ideas in this episode about what those linchpins are and what kind of positive future he would hope that they would lead to. I'll share my thoughts on those ideas in the outro here, but without further ado, let's fly right in. It was fun to be able to have Max with us. Hope you enjoyed this episode with Max Tegmark here in The Trajectory.
So Max, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
Yes, glad to at last be able to catch up here. Lots to discuss in a very short amount of time. Recently, there's been a major push on your side around this idea of tool AI, this new framework of sort of, autonomy and generality and intelligence being sort of factors that dive into that. That's going to be linked in the show notes. People can see the diagram. I think it's compelling that having all three would be that level 3 danger. I think that's an interesting way of framing it, and the level 2 dangers where they start to intersect. When you think about the linchpins of making that real from a policy vantage point, between the U.S., China, this is what everybody's worried about. We have some great Chinese delegates here today. What for you feels like the most important early steps there?
The first step is just to start treating AI like we treat every other industry. If you want to sell cars, no one wants to buy an uncontrollable car. They just want the powerful car that is like a tool. If you define tools as stuff that you can control, then you don't want the uncontrollable chainsaw, and you certainly don't want the uncontrollable smarter than human machines. So what the linchpin is, you get something like the FAA or the FDA saying, here are the safety standards for AI. And number one on the list is, hey, company, show us how this can be controlled before you start selling it. So stuff, which only involves, say, a lot of intelligence, like folding proteins and curing cancer.
Mentioned DeepMind,
obviously, easy to prove that it's a tool.
Yeah,
you're not going to lose control of AlphaFold. If it's a self-driving car that's very intelligent at driving and also autonomous, it's not going to take over the world either. People probably prefer it to just be a tool. They don't want the car that's also so generally intelligent that it can persuade you to vote for the other politician,
Yeah, or like diagnose your medical problems or something. You don't want that mostly.
You have a different tool for that.
Exactly.
That doesn't know how to drive or operate weapons or whatever. And so I think we'll get then very quickly a sort of golden age of AI tools all around the donut here, so to speak.
Without touching the middle there.
Without touching the middle yet, because we're obviously much closer to figuring out how to make smarter than human machines than figuring out how to control them. And, that's not something new. It's obviously easier to build an uncontrollable nuclear reactor that blows up than a controllable one.
Totally.
So the whole reason that we have controllable stuff in all other industries is because those are the only ones we allow people to build.
Absolutely. And I think there's been no precedent immediately for drastic AI risk. And so people don't think of it in the same way. Here's my supposition. You talk about the stages there where initially we get these kind of FAA equivalents, and then the US and China sort of come together around this because we know it's a total loss if all of us destroy ourselves, and we get the other countries on board. And then eventually there's kind of like some great blissful concord there. We're going to get into the future in a moment. My suspicion is right now, it feels to me as though the logical case of, by golly, with an airplane, you wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
There's a libertarian inclination, and I think there's maybe a political inclination around like, hey, don't get on my computers and start telling me what to do. And it feels to me like the logical case of even loss of control is not self-evident to everybody. I mean, you might even see it here at this event, although this event is a much more microcosm of the people that do believe in it. Is there some suspicion that just the logical, let's make people aware, let's tell them to do the FAA, that just continues to flop until some kind of an AI not so good thing happens?
For sure. The logic is very solid, but we're in a situation now where most powerful decision makers think either that AI is just science fiction, that's 50 years away, that you can make smarter than human machines, or just take for granted that it can be controlled by humans.
Yeah.
Because they're sort of stuck in this false metaphor that AGI is like electricity or the internet.
It'll just do what I want. I push the button, that's it.
Yeah.
It'll be under my control.
If you look at people like Jeff Hinton saying the machines will take control, or even Alan Turing in 1951 said that, they're clearly not thinking about smarter than human robots as another tool like the steam engine. They're thinking about it as a new species. And if you have much smarter than humanoid robots, of course they can build robot factories and build new robots and reproduce and do all the other stuff that a species does. And I think for most people, if that penny drops, that we're talking about building a smarter species, then it starts to feel really natural that the smarter species controls. Just go down here to the Paris Zoo and ask who's in the cages.
It's obvious.
The tigers or the humans?
It's patently obvious. Yeah. Look, I'm following you here. I guess my suspicion is this logic for most people. So think about Bengio himself.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I have a survey of him basically laughing at AGI risk.
Yeah.
Nice guy. Now, since he's, of course, changed his tune, ChatGPT got Bengio to change his mind. Like, if that's what it takes for Bengio to change his mind, what do you think will change the legacy enterprise and political apparatus? My suspicion is the wallop would have to be more firm.
Yeah.
Now, there are some wallops from which we could not recover.
Yeah.
I would love if awareness alone could get the job done. Do you suspect that with enough of it and with enough of these analogies, it'll eventually click? Because I fear the click took a long time for some of the big dogs, Max.
That's exactly the concern. I have no doubt that at some point it'll click. Let's just make sure that it clicks before it's too late, when we're already halfway over the cliff. And I think it's this year, we're going to start seeing a lot more autonomous agents out there doing stuff in the world with your bank accounts and hacking you and even embodied. That might make it click. We might have some very unfortunate big accidents that also make it click. Yeah. Another hopeful thought is that I'm not hopeful for the accidents, but if we get a wake-up call before it's too late, it might just be the thing that saves us. And another hopeful thing is that the national security folks in the U.S. and in China will start to realize that they, on their list of threats, that other superpower and North Korea and so on, they also need to add out of control machines
alien
there,
intelligence,
because those folks are actually less likely to dismiss stuff as science fiction. They were very quick to realize that nuclear weapons were a game changer, even while the average Joe thought it was science fiction, for example. And the last thing that, for example, the Chinese government or the CIA want to do is just, for their government to just lose control.
I guess you're bringing up the crux here, which is we need what I would call kind of the political singularity. This would be when every Tom, Dick, and Harry can recognize actually the education policy in my small town in Wisconsin doesn't matter compared to who builds and who controls the sand god. Yeah. That's actually the most important thing. So for Tom, Dick, and Harry to get that, I come from a very small 4,000 person town where people still don't care about these things. So by the time they care, which would mean that the political rallying would be very grand, we would want that to occur before the really hard takeoff occurs. But like we're still sort of, it sounds like, in a little bit of a hoping mode with enough awareness, some good frameworks. We're going to have the scare triggers where the Bengio equivalents within the defense ministries and within the political apparatus will, cross our fingers, wake up.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a tough battle to fight to make it click there, but it's the most important battle. We all have it, and I have 3 kids. My youngest is 2 years old, and I really want them to have a long and meaningful future. So I'm willing to fight hard, even if the chances are only 20% of success. And I think that many people are too pessimistic actually about international collaboration about this, because they're so stuck in this idea that the default is you could control AGI and superintelligence. So the superpowers are still mostly afraid of each other rather than the sand god itself.
Yeah.
And that's too pessimistic, because once that penny drops, that it's even scarier for China if the sand god takes over as opposed to the US. Everything else kind of falls into place.
Well, fingers crossed. I think there's a difference between a dividing disaster and a uniting disaster. Of course, there's another category called extinction disasters, after which you and I have no more conversations. But a dividing disaster would be one where, after the dust settles, the great powers look at each other and say, how could you do that? There's another kind of disaster where they look at each other and say, how are we going to handle this? The latter would be uniting. The former would be dividing. I worry that the first disaster, even if small, China might, even if it wasn't done intentionally, say, that's one of your frickin' things to try to knock us off the pedestal. I worry about that. How would we combat that?
That's why your podcast is so important. It's the same thing with, when Fukushima happened and 3 Mile Island, if people had immediately blamed that on Chinese hackers, they would have drawn completely different lessons from it than that they should up their game on nuclear safety. And there's certainly a risk that in the first bigger AI disaster happens caused by, for example, American AI run amok, the company will just blame it on Chinese hackers to save their own skin. Or vice versa if something happens in China. So that's why your podcast is so important, to get people used to the idea that actually it's quite likely that this stuff will should be blamed on the machines themselves. So people really attribute it correctly when it happens.
And not just, I guess, attributed to the malice of the great enemy of some
kind. And indeed, when Chernobyl happened, the Russians did not blame it on U.S. sabotage, precisely because communicators like you had just made it generally clear to people that the technology itself
had some dangers. Yeah. So the hope is, with enough shared understanding of control, when a control issue happens, more people would be likely to say, maybe it's the damn tech, and not another person. So you brought up your children. I've seen an interesting shift in both yourself and Jan Tallinn, who I first interviewed something like 6 years ago, from sort of, definitely an addressing of risk to also kind of a much more far-seeing exuberance of the cosmic potential of intelligence than most people did, right? You were in that camp way before most people were. Clearly now the emphasis is much more on the defense in the near term. Tallinn also mentions his children as like a big reason of like why I'm focused on the now. But let's assume we get this stuff right for you. You've talked a lot about, we're building this for humans. You've also talked about, in a longer term future, maybe there are moral agents, that is to say, wise, rich qualia, grand creative capabilities we don't understand, as sea snails don't understand most of what you and I are doing right now, that eventually some of that would roll forward or out into the world. Maybe we get humans really safe first, but maybe that is still a worthy thing. Is that even on your mind anymore? Or is it like, hey, Dan, 2,000 years from now, I literally want, like, maybe not as dumb as a toaster, but like way just completely within our control? Or would you see, like, once it is aligned to your satisfaction, that expanse could continue to occur, the 3.0 idea you had?
I'm very open-minded. I haven't changed my mind at all on the upside. First of all,
even the posthuman upside, I mean, your human upside is clear.
First of all, it's very clear that if we manage to build tools that amplify our human intelligence with AI, right, we can use it to solve all these problems that have stumped us. Like, I have a friend right now who has been diagnosed with incurable cancer. That just means we humans have been so far not been smart enough to solve it. It'll be fantastic if we can solve these things, lift everybody out of poverty, and create this amazing age of prosperity for us humans with us in charge.
Yep.
If you look farther into the future, I think most people had always assumed that maybe in a million years somehow humanity won't be here in its present form. And if you want to go to the Andromeda galaxy, you
have to be something
you're not going
biological.
Flying a meat bag there for 3 million years is much less feasible than, at least at the minimum, uploading yourself and sending yourself there in an intergalactic email to some microconstructors that build you there. So, if you want life to not just thrive here on this little spinning ball, but also throughout much of our universe, of course, you want to have more diverse life forms as well that are more maybe post-biological.
Yes.
That's very different from saying, I want that to happen in 4 years, and I want my children to die then.
I think there's a big difference.
Yeah.
There. But there are eternal hominid kingdom people. Omohundro may even be one of them. Omohundro, whom I have great respect.
Me too.
And
me too.
Recently, I know you collaborate with Steve. So just to clarify on that, to your point, hey, unless we nail safety, I think there's a risk that not only do we extinguish humans as intelligence blossoms and spreads the flame of life into the galaxy, but we may just extinguish life if we screw this up.
For sure.
All of the future life. And that would be really tragic. You mentioned, hey, let's get this right first. Longer term, things could evolve as they do, but let's focus here. What would have to be the provable, alignment, maybe part of this, what would have to be the provable traits of such an entity for you to be like, you know what, we're in a great spot. My friend doesn't have incurable cancer anymore. In fact, he's got all kinds of cool stuff he never had before. Life should, this thing that we value should continue in richer forms. I think we could let it sort of rock. What would it have to have for you to feel okay about that? That's not a 4 years thing. It's not a 4 months thing. It might not even be a 4 decades thing. What is that for you?
If you're in a hospital and someone gives you a cancer diagnosis, and then it turns out the hospital's on fire, for a few minutes there, you're going to stop thinking about your cancer diagnosis, just get out of the hospital, right?
I'm with you.
And I think we're in that situation right now where we're in this completely artificial and unnecessary level of stress for oh my gosh, how AGI is coming in 3 years or 5 years, how are we going to figure out how to make it safe in time? That's a completely artificial situation. If you have safety standards that say you can't release the product until it's controllable, then we can take our time. So step one, obviously, is get out of the burning hospital.
I like the
put some safety standards in place. And you asked about alignment. I actually have decided to stop using that word because it's been co-opted by tech lobbyists to mean pathetically lame things compared to what it used to mean. Now people say, oh, my AI is aligned because it's not going to offend you. The more interesting thing to ask is a much lower ask and say, can you control the AI? Will it, for example, let you turn it off if you ask it to? That's a lower bar. And even there, we have no clue how to figure out how to make a superintelligence that will let you control it, even in that minimal sense.
Yes.
Steve Omohundro, as you mentioned, pointed out that basically any open-ended goal you've given it will make it not want to be turned off. So I say, let's just start there. No one can sell AI systems until they can demonstrate to independent experts that don't have a financial conflict of interest that they can at least control, that we can at least control this thing. That will buy us the time to have these conversations. Because, you were talking about what could happen in hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of years.
Sure.
What's the rush? What difference does it make if we spend another 5 or 10 years figuring out how to make this powerful AI right? It's completely insane to risk squandering the whole thing just to hustle it out 1 year earlier to beat the competitor to the punch.
And well, of course, that's a dynamic we're unfortunately in right now.
Yeah.
But I guess the things that come to mind immediately are, and as we kind of wrap, maybe I'll have a closing thought on this. Lots to chew on. You brought up, you go visit the zoo here. Who's in the cages? Who's not? Presuming we eventually can align it to whatever sufficient degree to the point where
the forbidden buzzword.
The forbidden buzzword.
Let's say control it to the degree you want. For starters.
Sure.
You can get rid of the controls later if you and the rest of humanity have agreed that somehow it has our values, whatever. But let's start with a much easier thing.
Sure. And control's not even my bag. My bag is the proliferation of the flame that you had talked about.
Yeah.
That's my bag.
Yeah.
But I'm also all about not messing up the torch we've got, which is really crucial. It sounds like for you, hey, control may not be super permanent after a certain threshold.
Yeah, maybe you don't even want it at some point.
At some point. But so you'd say that, but obviously the focus would be to not be treated like, let's say, said zoo animals or something worse. Let's really just focus on the task at hand. The burning hospital seems to be the apt analogy from you, if I'm getting this correctly.
Yeah, for sure. And the super easy fix to all of this is, again, just to say, let's have at least as many safety standards for AI companies in the US as we have for sandwich shops.
Yeah.
You know, you can't sell your first sandwich until the safety inspector has come in and checked your kitchen and stuff. But you can legally release super intelligence in the US tomorrow.
Bonkers.
If you have it.
Completely bonkers.
With no standards whatsoever. That's completely bonkers.
Yeah.
And I find incredibly disingenuous when AI companies keep saying, yeah, we're trying to build super intelligence, but it's too early to have regulations, even though they know it takes longer time usually to get laws passed in the US than they are forecasting for AGI.
I think they're doing what behooves their interests at this point, right? If you're close to kind of winning, if your only choices are being devoured by your own sand god or someone else's, we can only expect racing. But I think governance is what we must impose.
They're actually not doing what's in their own interest either. They're more like Bernie Madoff characters who screw everyone else over while also destroying themselves. They're engaging in a wishful thinking, falling for the Kool-Aid of their own press releases, saying, "Oh, we can control this stuff."
I don't think they believe that. I think Dario and Altman and Musk before they were running labs, they were pretty clear, like, yeah, this will shred us. But when they knew I'm either going to get shredded by someone else or myself, they'd rather pick themselves. That final flex.
But wishful thinking is a very powerful bias. You know, Dario is on record saying 10 to 25% disaster. So,
Russian roulette.
So then
Russian
probably
roulette.
Maybe now he says that maybe we can get it down to 8% or something, and it's just somehow willing to take that risk. People are very good at persuading themselves that they're not the bad guy, you know, that things are, what they're doing is good. And I actually think that we don't need to make the CEOs or the most powerful politicians want differently. We just have to make them understand that more clearly that we're much closer to building this stuff than being able to control it.
I suspect you'd agree that the hope would be to shift from awareness to some degree of hard or soft governance that could bar this stuff from taking off in the rough ways.
And hard governance, of course. So you can ask these people from the companies, look, they have all these internal voluntary commitments they've done.
Yeah.
Why don't they want to uplift them to be binding laws that apply to the competitors too? You should ask them when you talk
Absolutely.
to them. But I don't think it's at all hopeless. I'm actually quite hopeful now that Sam Altman he's going to have a baby this year. That he will.
That is a commonality.
That he will reduce his risk tolerance a little bit.
Yeah.
And be more open to
his Faust parameter in Scott Aronson's terms of like how much are you willing to risk it all for? Do you think that'll drop significantly with a kid?
I know from people. I mean, Sam Altman. I've known him for many years. He is an idealistic guy who really wants what's good. And everybody I know who has had kids has shifted their Faust parameter in a good direction.
I will say that's a commonality as well. There probably at some point could be an episode just on that, but we don't have time for it today, Max. I'm glad we got to cover what we wanted to, and I want to respect that you got to get out of here. It's been a real blast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Glad to be here.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Max for being able to join us, and thank you to you for tuning in all the way through to the end of this episode. I like the AGI idea that Max had, and I want to share some thoughts about sort of takeaways from our conversation. Max had a reasonable amount of confidence that the progression of the technology itself would kick off some kind of spook factors within the minds of people, in particular in his vantage point, maybe folks in the military in the US and China, and be able to get the same kind of conclusion to mind that like, hey, maybe this is sort of beyond us and we need to find a way to agree to it. I wish I shared Max's optimism on that strategy and that approach. I'm not so sure that a gradual buildup of technology that at least initially is innocuous will actually ring bells. I think right now, if we look at what AI can do today compared to like 8 years ago, we've checked so many boxes of what people would call general intelligence, and the bells just are simply not ringing. And so I'm not sure if they will. In addition, I think there should be, and I've talked to a number of people at the AI Action Summit in Paris about this, and there's much more to be written on it. The idea of kind of building a sort of catalog of triggers that could sort of foster international dialogue around artificial general intelligence. The classic one is the scary demo. Let's get AI to deepfake somebody and show people how easy it is to mess with them. Or there was a video called, I think, Murder Bots that was showing little robo drones that were going around kind of sniping individual people. Very scary video, kind of plausible notion of sort of what spooky AI might be capable of doing. I think the scary demo has credence, but I think there's other tools we might want to pull on. I think there's an idea of an envy demo, right? What if leadership within certain enterprise sectors was sort of aware of the sort of lack of regulation within global sort of artificial intelligence products and services compared to, let's say, their world of life sciences or financial services or other heavily regulated industries? Is there a way that some international pressure towards cooperation could come from there? Again, is that the right fuel to burn, right? Is envy the right fuel to burn? But do the means justify the end if it means some degree of concord and understanding between the US and China so that we don't hurl an unworthy successor sand god into the world? Open questions. I simply think that there should be a menu of options. I think the sharing and awareness of frameworks, I think, is good. And I think, Max is clearly doing great work there. And there's a lot of interesting, I think, frameworks up in the air. We interviewed Duncan Kasbeggs recently on the AI in Business podcast. They've got a proposal I think has a lot of kosher elements in terms of sort of what we're going to need for international governance. Awareness of those frameworks, the progression of the technology, what else? What's the grocery list of individual triggers, kinds of demos, kinds of ways of sparking collaboration, thinking about different stakeholders, not just US big tech, China big tech, but who are the other stakeholders that could sort of foster that dialogue? I think there's a bigger article, a bigger effort about coming up with that grocery list and seeing who's working on which ones when it comes to AI governance that I hope we sort of get to. So these are some of the side thoughts from my conversation with Max, but I appreciate his frameworks and hope you got to benefit from it. So that's all for this episode. I look forward to catching you here the next time on The Trajectory.